started. We are running a tight ship here today, so it'll be fast and furious coming at you. And to begin with, I wanted to introduce Steve Cole, who is the president of the New America Foundation and our intrepid leader here at New America, and he will welcome you all here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sasha, and thank you all for being here. Good morning. My name is Steve Cole. I'm the president of New America. I'm privileged to introduce our speaker, Chairman Genachowski, today, and I thought I'd do that also on behalf of Sasha Meinrath, who was just up here and didn't state his name, and Michael Calabrese, his colleague, and Tom Glazer upstairs, and the whole group here that works at the Open Technology Institute and on media policy, who've done so much to bring forward provocative ideas about telecommunications policy over the last 10 years. I think when the new administration came to town, those of us who had been around here for a while and watched the new team form picked out a few people who we thought were the right appointments in critical positions. I think of people like Arnie Duncan, and I think of Julius Genachowski as well. A lot of you know his resume. For those of you who don't, it's really ideally formed for the extraordinarily important challenge that he and the commission face. He's a graduate of Harvard Law, and he clerked for David Souter and William Brennan and Avner Mikva, and he has served on the Hill as an investigator in the old Iran-Contra days, for those of you who are old enough to remember that period of Washington history. He served as general counsel at the FCC. He has a rich experience in private practice, particularly in innovation and technology, as the new world of digital telecommunications took shape. He's been an innovator as a leader. He's worked at IAC, which has really shown the way in a lot of the new media space. And he also has a background in nonprofits and social entrepreneurship. And so he really has worked at all three of the relevant sectors that now face the commission as it tries to balance and locate the public interest in the policy dilemmas that it faces. And I think he's been an articulate visionary of the future who has worked very hard to locate constituencies for the common good in telecommunications policy. And I think in that sense, it was a very deliberate appointment and a very important one. Our colleague at New America, Tim Wu, always reminds us when we talk about telecommunications policy that we shouldn't overinterpret the novelty of any particular telecommunications revolution. We're always having them. And it's true that there have been other important crossroads comparable to this one. That's not me. So whoever it is, the rest of you, be reminded to silence your phones. There have been times, such as the transition out of the utility structure that AT&T represented, and other moments where we've been obviously passing through an important portal of policy and technological change and economics. But I can't think of a period of that character, such as the one we're in now, where the consequences of the policy choices facing the country seem to be so obviously linked to our global competitive position, to our potential for innovation, and to the real challenges of sustainable, high-quality job creation that are obviously at the forefront of the country's national challenges. And so I do think that the process that's about to unfold, and which the chairman will speak about today, make a down payment on his vision, really is fundamental to the economic future of the United States. And it is a process that will begin with the broadband plan that will be announced next month, and it will unfold. But I have hopes for it not only because of the quality of the commission, but also because of the nature of the commission as a deliberative body in Washington. It's a place where, at its best, it's been able, somewhat more effectively than in other branches of government from time to time, to bring together the private sector, the public interest, public policy, and actually set a course that is sustainable. And so I think with that introduction, I'd like to welcome to the podium. Please do give a warm welcome to Chairman Genachowski.
Do you mind if I grab some water? Thank you, Steve, both for that terrific introduction and also for efficiently actually giving my speech, because you've said many of the things that I'm about to say, and I appreciate that. Thanks to you, thanks to New America for hosting this event. I'd like to recognize, Steve, you and New America for your leadership on communications issues and spectrum issues, in particular the work of Michael Calabrese, who I see on your Wireless Future program, Sasha Meinrath, on the Open Technology Initiative. New America has filed extensive and specific comments on our National Broadband Plan. Everyone here should know that we have taken them to heart, and if you have a problem with the substance of my remarks or the plan, you should take it up with Steve Cole and not me. Also, I see many of you in this room who have been ringing the bell on broadband for a very long time. We and the country benefit from your work a great deal, and I expect we'll see the results of that work in the National Broadband Plan and in the months ahead as we tackle this important challenge for the country. As Steve indicated, and as many of you know, as part of the Recovery Act, Congress and the President charged the FCC with developing a strategy to bring high-speed internet and its benefits to all Americans. Less than a month from now, we'll deliver the National Broadband Plan to Congress. In the past, I've likened the development of this plan to running a marathon at a sprinter's pace. But as I was watching my required 3 hours of NBC last night, I realized that a more apt sports metaphor for the National Broadband Plan would be the Winter Olympics. Now, let me explain. First, the National Broadband Plan will be the culmination of a tremendous amount of hard work and effort. For months, a dedicated team has been working around the clock, a team that includes engineers, economists, and entrepreneurs, lawyers, academics, analysts, consumer advocates, some of the very best public servants in the business, drawing from every bureau and office at the FCC. They have been driven by the imperative of developing a meaningful plan for U.S. global leadership in broadband to create jobs and spur economic growth, to unleash new waves of innovation and investment, and to improve education, healthcare, energy efficiency, public safety, and the vibrancy of our democracy. Hats off to this world-class team. The second way that the National Broadband Plan is like the Olympics, the ultimate goal is to earn a gold medal for the United States. The challenge is we're lagging behind when it comes to broadband. Multiple studies have the U.S. ranked outside the top 10 when it comes to broadband penetration and speed. While some people take exception with those studies, few would suggest, and I don't think anyone can, that we're leading the world in broadband or even as close as we should be. And I can tell you from speaking to my counterparts in other countries, the rest of the world is not sitting around waiting for us to catch up. Consider a study that Intel CEO Paul Otellini described yesterday. The study ranked the U.S. 6th in the world in innovative competitiveness and 40th out of the 40 countries ranked in the rate of change of innovative capacity. The first of those rankings is enough of a concern. That last place statistic is the canary in the coal mine. The costs of our failure to lead, the costs of our failure to seize the moment are high. As IBM CEO Sam Palmisano recently put it, and I quote, "Without pervasive broadband, our country will not be prepared for a new world that is increasingly built on the fusion of the physical and the digital. For U.S. businesses to lead across the globe and for innovation to flourish at home, we need to invest in the infrastructure of the future, broadband. We need robust and open broadband flourishing with applications and services that we can only begin to imagine. We have extraordinary capacity in the U.S. to build the best computers, the best chips, the best applications and services in the world, but we are at risk of wasting that asset if we don't have great broadband infrastructure, wired and wireless. It would be like having the technology for great electric cars, but terrible roads. When it comes to mobile broadband, the subject that I want to focus on today, our goal is clear: to benefit all Americans and promote our global competitiveness. the U.S. must have the fastest, most robust, and most extensive mobile broadband networks and the most innovative mobile broadband marketplace in the world. This will be a core goal of the National Broadband Plan. To meet that goal, our plan is ambitious but straightforward. Accelerate the broad deployment of mobile broadband by moving to recover and reallocate spectrum. Update our 20th century spectrum policies to reflect 21st century technologies and opportunities. Remove barriers to broadband build-out. Lower the cost of deployment and promote competition. No area of the broadband ecosystem holds more promise for transformational innovation than mobile. Breakthrough new devices that put the power of a PC in your pocket, combined with billions in network investment, have liberated broadband from the desktop and made it possible to imagine a world where the internet is available to anyone, anywhere, anytime. And some of America's greatest innovators have clearly been working overtime to seize the opportunity, as the iPad and the Kindle attest. While mobile broadband is still in the preliminaries, to stick with the Olympics theme, we've seen enough to say some things definitively. This is a sector that can fundamentally transform our society and our economy. Mobile broadband can be about many things. Mobile broadband can be about job creation and economic growth. Jobs in the mobile network economy, jobs building out and managing extensive mobile broadband networks, and jobs in the mobile apps economy. According to Gartner, $4.2 billion in mobile applications were sold last year, up from essentially zero just a couple of years ago. The number of apps available, mobile apps available, has now crossed 150,000. Studies show that increases in mobile broadband adoption translate into increases in economic growth and job creation. Mobile broadband can be about education. Last week, a New York Times article described an Arizona school district that installed Wi-Fi on one of its school buses. The bus was instantly transformed into a rolling study hall. And if anyone ever doubts the power of mobile broadband, tell them this. The driver says that high school bus is now quiet. Mobile broadband can be about healthcare. Mobile medicine takes remote monitoring to a new level. A patient's heart rhythm can be monitored continuously, regardless of her whereabouts. Diabetics can receive continuous, flexible insulin delivery through real-time glucose monitoring sensors that transmit data to wearable insulin pumps. Mobile broadband can be about energy. With mobile broadband, consumers and businesses can utilize smart grid-enabled information devices. A whole new world of energy apps can adjust lights, heating, and cooling from a smartphone or a netbook, saving electricity, saving our environment, and saving money to boot. Mobile broadband can be about public safety. With mobile broadband, emergency medical technicians, and I say this as a former EMT, can beam images of a patient wirelessly from the road so that emergency room doctors can review them while the patient is in transit. First responders can also access a patient's medical records almost instantaneously when they arrive on the scene. As someone who spent some time on an ambulance in some of the tougher parts of Manhattan, I can tell you that mobile broadband will be a huge opportunity for public safety. Mobile broadband can be about 21st century government and enhanced civic engagement. During the recent snowstorm, Howard County, Maryland equipped all 120 of its snowplowers with GPS receivers. A website displayed the truck's positions and the status of county streets, and county residents could see which streets had been plowed, salted, or sanded. Families who lost power used their smartphones as a lifeline, coordinating cleanup efforts. And we're all seeing the ways in which mobile services like Twitter can enhance participation in public life. And of course, that's just the beginning. And so these early days of mobile broadband demonstrate tremendous opportunities for our country. But they also reveal serious challenges to America's hopes for global leadership in mobile. For starters, although the potential of mobile broadband is limitless, its oxygen supply is not. Spectrum, our airwaves, really is the oxygen of mobile broadband service. Without sufficient spectrum, we will starve mobile broadband of the nourishment it needs to thrive as a platform for innovation, job creation, and economic growth. And the fact is, America is facing a looming spectrum crunch. As part of our broadband process, the FCC received a letter from over 100 companies, including Amazon, Apple, AT&T, Cisco, Dell, Intel, Microsoft, Motorola, Verizon, entities representing billions of investment and millions of American jobs. These companies were united in telling the FCC, quote, "Without more spectrum, America's global leadership in innovation and technology is threatened." Let's look at some numbers. Mobile data usage is not just growing, it's exploding. AT&T reports that its mobile data traffic is up 5,000% over the past 3 years. It's not surprising when you consider that a typical smartphone generates 30 times the traffic of a traditional data-enabled phone, and a netbook generates 450 times more traffic. According to Cisco, North American wireless networks carried 17 petabytes per month in 2009. By 2014, they're projected to carry 740 petabytes per month. Now, even if you think a petabyte is something that sends you to the emergency room, you know that that's a game-changing trajectory. There is spectrum coming to market. Counting 2008's 700 megahertz auction, the FCC in recent years has authorized a threefold increase in commercial spectrum for mobile broadband. But that increase will not allow us to keep pace with an estimated 30-fold increase in traffic. While the spectrum crunch is a serious obstacle threatening the growth of mobile broadband, it is not the only one. Wireless providers also face red tape and needless barriers, which slow deployment and increase the cost of investment. The cost of obtaining permits and leasing pole attachments and rights-of-way can amount to 20% of fiber deployment, which is necessary for wireless networks as well as wired networks. With our tower siting shot clock order in November, the Commission already begun to take action to cut red tape, lower the cost of investment, and accelerate network deployments, but more needs to be done. Another serious problem is that the mobile broadband revolution is not reaching all Americans. Many homes are technically passed by mobile broadband networks in some of the surveys and studies that you see, but still cannot get a clear signal inside their home. And a mobile divide is an increasingly important part of the digital divide. In Alaska, for example, 23% of its population doesn't have access to 3G mobile broadband. In West Virginia, at least 29% of its population lacks coverage. A final major issue. We're still way behind on communications interoperability for first responders years after a call to action was issued by the 9/11 Commission. And the situation is even worse when it comes to mobile broadband for first responders. While a portion of the 700 megahertz spectrum has been allocated for public safety broadband use, our country still needs to build out that network. With our National Broadband Plan, the Commission will lay out its most dramatic actions yet to position America as a global leader in mobile broadband innovation. What are we going to do? The Broadband Plan will represent the first step in what my colleague FCC Commissioner Meredith Baker says, and which she has urged us to pursue, quote, an ongoing strategic planning process on spectrum policy to ensure that the agency's stewardship of the public's airwaves is smart, future-oriented, and serves as an ongoing engine of innovation and investment, unquote. First, we're going to announce a game plan to unleash more spectrum for mobile broadband. The National Broadband Plan will set a goal of freeing up 500 megahertz of spectrum over the next decade. We will work with the NTIA to do so. And one of the best ways for us to achieve the right balance in the supply and demand of spectrum is to establish market-based mechanisms that enable spectrum intended for the commercial marketplace to flow to the uses the market values most. The Broadband Plan will recommend one such mechanism. It will propose a mobile future auction, an auction permitting existing spectrum licensees, such as television broadcasters and spectrum-starved markets, to voluntarily relinquish spectrum in exchange for a share of auction proceeds and allow spectrum sharing and other spectrum efficiency measures. Now, I've mentioned broadcast spectrum, so let me be clear, the recommendation is for a voluntary program. While overwhelmingly, roughly 90% of Americans receive their broadcast TV programming in most major markets through cable wires or satellite signals, there are still millions of Americans who receive TV through over-the-air antenna TV. Broadcasters would be able under this plan to continue to serve their communities with free over-the-air local news, information, and entertainment, and they would be able to experiment with mobile TV. But the mobile future auction would allow broadcasters to elect to participate in a mechanism that could save costs for broadcasters while also being a major part of the solution to one of our country's most significant challenges. Why look at broadcast spectrum as a major part of our spectrum strategic planning? First, a broad range of analysts, companies, trade associations participating in our broadband proceeding agree that a clear candidate for allocation is spectrum in the broadcast TV bands. They point to a massive amount of unlocked value in that spectrum, which has characteristics that make it particularly suitable for mobile broadband. One study suggests that as much as $50 billion in value could be unlocked if we adopted policies to convert some of the broadcast spectrum to mobile broadband. This, of course, suggests that there are inefficiencies in the current allocation and suggests the beginning of the opportunities of a smart strategic planning exercise when it comes to the spectrum and serving the public interest. A second reason is that the highly valuable spectrum currently allocated for broadcast television is not being used efficiently. Indeed, much is not being used at all. About 300 megahertz of spectrum has been set aside for broadcast TV. In markets with less than 1 million people, only 36 megahertz are typically used for broadcasting. In cities with more than 1 million people, on average, about 100 megahertz is used. Even in our largest cities, at most, only about 150 megahertz out of 300 megahertz are used. This is true even after the recent reallocation for digital television, which freed up some spectrum for mobile broadband. New technologies allow, indeed they require, new strategic planning to ensure the most efficient use of spectrum, a vital public resource, especially given our broadband needs. Because of the billions of dollars of unlocked value in broadcast spectrum, and because of the current inefficient spectrum allocation, the Mobile Future Auction is a win-win proposal. For broadcasters, who win more flexibility to pursue business models to serve their local communities, and for the public, which wins more innovation in mobile broadband services, continued free over-the-air television, and the benefits of the proceeds of new and substantial auction revenues. One thing is clear. It typically takes quite some time, many years, from the beginning to end of a commission's strategic spectrum reallocation process, but the clock is ticking on our country's mobile broadband leadership opportunity and our global competitiveness challenge, and we have to get started. Our plan for mobile broadband will also recommend applying a more flexible approach to other frequency bands, where our rules, technical rules, service rules may be holding back the broadband potential of large swaths of spectrum. We need to bring our spectrum policies into the 21st century. The plan proposes resolving long-standing debates about how to maximize the value of spectrum in bands such as the mobile satellite service or wireless communication service by giving licensees the option of new flexibility to put the spectrum toward mobile broadband use, or the option of voluntarily transferring the license to someone who will. Now, vital elements of the Commission's charter are to ensure that, in exercising our responsibilities with respect to spectrum, we promote competition and ensure that spectrum use is in the public interest. And of course, all spectrum policy decisions will be made with those core values in mind. In addition, our National Broadband Plan will encourage innovative ways of using spectrum, including what some call opportunistic uses, to encourage the development of new technologies and new spectrum policy models. Unlicensed spectrum, for example, has been a proven testbed for emerging competition, injecting new investment and innovation into the marketplace, and spawning new services and devices from Bluetooth to Wi-Fi. The market for Wi-Fi equipment alone is about $4 billion a year, and analysts project the market for Wi-Fi-enabled health products will reach $5 billion in 2014. This is on what people used to call the junk band, until the FCC released it for unlicensed use, and innovators got to work. In addition, new ideas such as databases that dynamically enable or revoke access to spectrum in particular times and places promise to change the way we think about spectrum. For example, entrepreneurs could create new types of devices and ad hoc networks, enabling new innovative uses of spectrum. And, spurred by the smart persistence of my colleague Commissioner Michael Copps, the broadband plan will include a recommendation that we invest a sufficient amount in R&D to ensure that the science underpinning spectrum use continues to advance. To close the adoption gap, our broadband plan would propose the creation of a mobility fund as part of broader reforms of the Universal Service Fund. Without increasing the overall size of the fund, the plan will seek to provide one-time support for deployment of infrastructure enabling robust mobile broadband networks to bring all states to a minimum level of mobile availability. Bringing all states up to a national standard will help Americans in unserved areas participate in the mobile revolution. Finally, and critically, to improve mobile communications for our first responders, we will develop the 700 megahertz public safety broadband network to achieve long overdue interoperability. I'll have more to say on public safety tomorrow, but let me mention now that we'll have a comprehensive public safety strategy in the National Broadband Plan. At a high level, our goals will be achieved through public-private partnerships between public safety and 700 megahertz commercial service providers, including but not limited to a commercial licensee of the D block. The plan will also recommend the establishment and funding of an emergency response interoperability center within the FCC to develop common technical standards for interoperability on the public safety broadband network from the start, and to update these standards periodically as broadband technology evolves. These are all programs in an ambitious plan to deliver the benefits of broadband service, both wireless and wired, to all Americans, and to invest in and build a world-leading broadband infrastructure in the U.S. There is an enormous amount of work to be done. The National Broadband Plan will chart a clear path forward, and if we do not seize the moment, I fear for the opportunity we will have lost. Let me close with one last comparison to the Olympics. The Olympics are unique in sport because they only come every 4 years. When you get your chance, you better make it count, because you don't know when or if you'll get another shot. With this plan, we have a special opportunity to lay a foundation for American leadership in the 21st century. If we get it right, broadband will be an enduring engine for creating jobs and growing our economy, for spreading knowledge and enhancing civic engagement, for advancing a healthier, sustainable way of life. This is our moment. Let's seize it. Thank you. Question?
So I think we have time for about one, maybe two questions if they're asked pithily, so please do. And I would encourage, if you've never had an opportunity to ask a question of the chairman or the FCC, now's your chance. So I'd ask if for those that are the usual suspects, give a chance for folks that haven't had a chance to raise their hands to do so. And if you haven't, please do raise your hands. I got one back there. Yes. Back here. Yes, go ahead. Where's microphone's coming to you.
So you announced a 100 squared initiative recently. So the mobile broadband will be a part of this initiative. So that means so mobile broadband. You are expecting the mobile broadband will be around 100 meg capacity on 2020.
Well, we'll be announcing in the broadband plan a number of key national goals for the United States. The goal of the 100 Squared initiative is to make sure that the U.S. in 2020 has the largest market in the world for broadband, so that this is the place where the world's best innovators, best companies start, invent, create jobs, build the future. We'll also have goals around mobile, chiefly that we lead the world in robust, extensive, fastest mobile broadband networks, so that a mobile broadband platform can serve its potential as a vital source for innovation, companies, jobs. People get confused sometimes when it comes to broadband. I know when we started this process, a lot of the people I spoke with at the beginning thought that broadband meant wired and wired only. And one of the things that we'll be saying clearly in the plan is that wired broadband is essential, and so is wireless broadband. One other point. We don't know. No one in this room knows exactly what technology will bring, what our innovators will bring with respect to mobile technology over the last 10 years. We have some real hopes for the next generation of mobile technology and the level of speeds that they can deliver. What we want to do is make sure that we have a mobile infrastructure that leads the world, that's the fastest in the world, that's the most innovative world, as part of an overall broadband ecosystem that is also world-class, world-leading, universal, and that meets the moment for global competitiveness and innovation.
Thank you.
We'll take one more right up front here. Just wait for the
Thank you
microphone.
for joining us.
Wait for the microphone since this is being webcast.
I'm sure I speak for many people here. My concern is in keeping with your theme. You discussed spectrum being the oxygen for mobile broadband. I'm concerned about the circulatory system. How do we get fiber to all these places to backhaul this stuff, and can we build it fast enough?
It's a critical challenge, and we will be addressing in the plan a series of initiatives to accelerate the deployment of fiber as far and as deep in the network as possible. I talked a little bit about them today. Steps to address red tape that increases the cost of investment, slows it down. The tower siting order that we adopted a couple of months ago is a good example of the kind of thing that we'll do more of starting with the National Broadband Plan. There are companies that want to build out wireless networks. They want to put up towers. They have certain rights to challenge denials of putting up towers. And the whole system was getting held up because in some communities there wouldn't be decisions. And so in our order, we set a deadline, a shot clock for decisions. There are other things that we can do involving rights of way, including federal rights of way, that can lower the cost of deploying fiber, and that's something we'll address in the plan. I agree that it's important.
Thank you very much. We're going to transition now to the respondents. We have a very illustrious panel of folks, so I'd invite them to come up now. And don't worry, you'll have a lot of time to ask questions of folks and get some research and analysis on today's speech. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks very much.
So New America Foundation, we're a policy institute, a think tank, and so we very much enjoy the analysis portion of all of these regulatory policies and ideas. And I am joined today by four individuals who I think really help embody sort of smart thinking, innovative thinking around spectrum policy issues. And we have Ben Scott, who's the policy director for Free Press. We've got on my end here, we've got Chris Gutman-McCabe, who's VP of Regulatory Affairs for CTIA. The wireless industry, I believe, is your tag, which is a good person to have here, for sure. We've got Julie Kearney, who's VP of Regulatory Affairs for CEA, the Consumer Electronics Association. They're the folks that are making all the widgets and gizmos that we so love and use in every day. And Matt Wood, who's the Associate Director on the end there with the Media Access Project, who's been integral in working with us and the whole Media Access team and working with us and a lot of civil rights groups providing new perspectives into the FCC processes. So welcome to all of you. I want to give everyone a chance, 2 or 3 minutes, to just, with your initial thoughts on Chairman Genachowski's plan. And why don't we just start here and we'll work our way down.
Great. Thank you, Sasha. First of all, I'd like to thank Steve and Sasha and Michael for hosting us here, a great event, and want to thank the chairman and his staff for their hard work, and perhaps most importantly, Blair and his team at the FCC for all that they've done. They obviously were given a monumental task about a year ago to develop a plan for getting broadband to all of America, and they seem to be right on target. From our perspective, on reacting to the chairman's speech, obviously we're extremely pleased with what he had to say. We look forward to helping make his vision a reality. We see mobile broadband as a game changer. We think it will affect all elements of the nation's economy, from consumers and businesses, simple applications that make our lives easier, M-Health, smart grids, telemedicine, traffic management, fleet management. We heard the chairman mention many of these. We think that the wireless broadband will be transformational. We think its time is happening now, but we think that the chairman has identified a path to making sure and a foundation to making sure that the ecosystem continues to flourish and explode. So again, we want to thank the chairman. We understand and recognize that he is doing all he can to prop up the economy in terms of jobs, driving innovation, driving investment into the United States economy, and we think this is a tremendous first step. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. CEA and its members thank Chairman Genachowski and the Commission staff for their tireless efforts to expand the availability of broadband to all Americans. The Commission's recommendations, as discussed by the Chairman today, are a critical step forward in realizing this goal, and we look forward to reviewing the Commission's plan in detail. Manufacturers and retailers of technology devices and services understand that broadband is critical to our nation's economic recovery and global leadership in innovation. As the Chairman noted, our need for spectrum is not only about broadband, it is about U.S. competitiveness and jobs. The U.S. dominates the world in internet innovation. Just look at Google, eBay, Dell, Microsoft, the list goes on. Many of you are here today. But our ability to maintain our leadership role assumes a robust broadband market. Our movement forward as a nation depends on innovation, flexibility, high-speed broadband, and finding the best uses for spectrum. The FCC clearly understands this fact, as evidenced by Chairman Genachowski's remarks today, and CEA and our members look forward to working with the Commission to the benefit of all Americans. Thank you.
Well, let me echo the thanks that have been put out by my colleagues. It's great to be here. I'll just say a few words in comparing the speech that we just heard with many speeches about broadband that I have heard over the last 5 years or so in this town. And what's different about it is in previous years you heard broadband speeches that had 3 components. Component 1, we have a problem. We're falling behind the rest of the world. Our networks aren't what they ought to be. We have people who don't have access. The costs are too high. There is insufficient competition. Consumer protection rules aren't what they ought to be. And then we had component number 2, which was broadband is really good for you. Really it is. Lots of really important things can be done with broadband. And then in between there was question mark. And virtually no one ever put anything under the question mark. And so for ages we had this debate about the problems and the benefits, but without any real meat on the bone about how we were going to get from point A to point B. And today I think we're beginning to see the fruits of the labor of the National Broadband team. We're beginning to see the outlines of what's going to be put into that spot where the question mark was. I think we saw very clearly from Chairman Genachowski today. He's set a goal of restoring global leadership. He's recognizing the problems and addressing them head on. He's looking at competition policy. He's looking at lowering barriers to entry. He's looking at unlicensed spectrum. He's looking at reallocation and more efficient use of existing spectrum allocations. He's looking at a mobility fund and universal service. These are all ideas that have been floating around for a while, and it's great to see the Commission grabbing some of them and looking to put them into action.
In the spirit of shared use, which we applaud seeing in the National Broadband Plan. Yeah, thanks very much. Just echoing Ben's echoes of thanks to both the Chairman and the FCC and the incredibly hardworking National Broadband Plan team, and also to New America. Media Access Project, my organization, has been fortunate enough to work with New America and Sasha and Michael and Free Press and, of course, many others on these kinds of issues. And that's really what we're happiest about in the plan. Sometimes we get accused of being anti-auction or anti-exclusive use, and that's really not the case. We're just not in favor of solely looking to exclusive use and auctions for solving this upcoming spectrum crunch. And so that's why we're especially enthusiastic about seeing the Chairman talking about opportunistic use, not just of unlicensed space, but also where the license might stay with the Department of Defense or might stay with a commercial broadcaster, or sort of new ways of thinking about how to maximize use of the spectrum in all the different dimensions, and not just simply waiting for an auction and waiting for any number of hundreds of megahertz that might be great to have out there, but that will of course take anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15 years to actually get into the pipeline and get into productive use in commercial and public sector areas. Other than that, not many other reactions. I guess one other point that the Chairman talked about is barriers to entry, and we've talked about tower siting, and that's, of course, an important thing. The shot clock order that came out earlier this year. Special access comments happen to be due today. Reply comments in that proceeding that is also part of the National Broadband Plan overview, and that's something that also clogs the circulatory system, and something that we've worked on trying to speed up, make more friendly for, again, efficient use, and not just a choke point for carriers that happen to enjoy monopoly control over those kinds of facilities. So removing barriers to entry and looking at new ways of doing things are all certainly things that we've been advocating for quite some time, and we're very pleased to see them in the preview we got today of the plan's spectrum and innovation points.
Thank you all. Well, before we open it up for questions, I just wanted to ask a couple of our panelists and take the prerogative of moderator. And I think let's just start with you, Chris. We had a number of really interesting ideas floated by the chairman, and I'm curious, I'm one of the few people probably in this room that has actually built and deployed wireless networks for service provision of broadband. And I'm wondering, how do you see these proposals intersecting with driving sort of universal, affordable broadband access, particularly in areas that haven't been served thus far?
Well, so I guess I would say, Sasha, 2 points. First, it would be, well, first of all, I hope these wireless microphones are not in the 700 megahertz band, and if they are, that we change them out soon. To me, there were two elements of the chairman's speech that address your question. The first is, obviously, you need the foundation from a technical perspective. So you need towers and you need spectrum. And so the chairman and the commission did some good work on the tower siting, shot clock petition, and then he also mentioned access to poles and pole attachment. So that is key from a technology perspective of providing the foundation. And then in terms of adoption and the ability to deploy at a price point that people can adopt, he talked about having a mobility fund and driving mobility and mobile broadband to areas that don't have service. So I think both of those will be key to making sure that the United States as a whole, across all those areas, including the state of West Virginia and Alaska that the chairman mentioned, where there is a little bit of a mobile divide happening. I think those will be key. I also think, and at CTI we also have never said it should only be licensed spectrum, license. We think that there obviously should be a mix, and we're perfectly comfortable with the chairman addressing both. We do think that there's currently a shortfall in terms of the license space, and there needs to be a real focus on getting license into the pipeline. But we believe that innovation and investment happens in both areas.
Great, thank you. Julie, I've got one for you as well. I'm curious, I run a tech shop, right? I mean, we're sort of a tech tank inside a think tank, and whenever we get like the new iPhone, our first question is like, how do we open this thing so we can look inside? How do we take it apart? And clearly, spectrum is one of those spaces where we're seeing a tremendous number of new devices coming out in rapid succession. It seems like the second I get the new gizmo, it's already outdated. How does access to gobs of additional spectrum intersect with the work of your membership? Like, what is it going to do for next generation devices?
Well, I think we have shown in this country that we are very creative, and that if you build it, they will come. And for us, the playing field, once the spectrum is available, I think we've lived within sort of a confined environment now, and we've managed to build an incredible amount of devices. But you think about the things 5 years ago that we didn't even know would be available today. Netbooks, the iPad, and I believe that as we have more of a landscape available, more of a drawing pad, if you will, the innovation is just going to be boundless.
Great. Thanks. Thank you. So Ben, a number of us have been working for years now on this notion of more unlicensed, more opportunistic spectrum access, and we now have an FCC and a chairman that's saying that's what they're going to do. It sounds to me like public interest groups have perhaps finally been heard, and I'm curious not just what you think of the here and now, but sort of where do we go from here? What are going to be the next big pushes that we're going to want to make in this space?
Well, I guess my first reaction is yeehaw. It's good to see a commission moving forward on these ideas, many of which came right out of this shop and from the ingenious mind of Mr. Jim Snyder, who I see in the audience, giving credit where credit is due. This is an old issue that has really taken a long time to blossom. But I think one of the most interesting things happening in the wireless market today is this glut of data traffic use and how much of it is being offloaded from wireless devices onto Wi-Fi networks. And it points to two things, I think. One is the importance of having unlicensed spectrum, and unlicensed spectrum in different kinds of bands that do different things, some that go through obstacles, some that carry large amounts of data, and allow innovators to do interesting things with that unlicensed capacity. And second is, as I think one of the questioners raised, all of this traffic ultimately that's going over wireless networks is going to drop onto a wire line at some point. So in order to carry all this traffic, you're going to need to have that backhaul network in place, and we need to make sure that we address one of the key problems, which the chairman didn't say this, but I'll put words in his mouth. One of the key ways to promote competition is we've got to make sure that the transport costs of backhauling that traffic come down, and that you don't have these wild disparities of transport costs between different parts of the country. And as we begin to use wireless more and more as a last mile technology and innovative use technology, we've got to think of that as paired with our infrastructure project of pushing out wireline facilities. Otherwise, the whole thing collapses and none of it works.
Thank you. And Matt, Media Access Project, you guys are sort of the grandfathers of the public interest space, been around for decades, which is near on unheard of, and working to connect sort of groups that are perhaps not the usual inside the Beltway suspects into these proceedings and into these processes. I'm curious, how do you see the changes that are happening around these issues as we've seen groups like Magnet and Native Public Media and other groups that your group has helped and represented entering into these discussions and talking about their real-world experiences? How has that shifted, or what are you hearing from the real world outside of the Beltway?
I think it has shifted in the sense that we're still inside the Beltway, we're still working in this hothouse of regulatory law, but we do have groups coming into that from the outside, not just from Silicon Valley, but civil rights groups, community activists, people who are recognizing the importance of things like, not to make this Special Access Day, but like Special Access, like USF, like net neutrality. Not that we agree on those issues all the time with the people up here at this table, but people talking about these issues and thinking about them in real world terms, pocketbook terms. I was glad to hear in the chairman's speech this morning phrases like civic engagement and increasing participation in culture. We think that obviously the economic benefits of this sort of innovation in the wireless space are basically untold and unmeasured, but so too are the civic benefits and the benefits of having more people connected, more people engaged in the dialogue on the issues of the day, whether they're politics or the Olympics or whatever, people connecting with their families. And so we have groups like Magnet and Center for Media Justice and other groups who are probably unknown to most people in D.C., but are doing great work at the grassroots level in their communities. And really, we take no credit for it. It's those groups who have come to us and said, please let us into this. We have something to say in Washington, D.C. We realize this is important for our constituents here, and they are thinking about things like the mobile divide and all these other issues that are pretty specialized FCC issues now really coming home to Americans as people understand the importance of technology for their lives.
Thank you. So we're going to now open it up for Q&A from the audience, so gird yourselves, be ready. And we also are going to open up for questions from our online audience. So if you're watching this and are not in the room, or in fact, even if you are in the room, if you use the hashtag NAF events, it will show up on our feed and you will be able to have your questions asked of the panel. So with that, if you could raise your hands, and why don't we start with Jim Snyder, who's right over there in the corner and is one of the folks that helped pioneer these notions of reuse of federal spectrum that now have, I guess the shot clock's about 6 years from genesis of new ideas to implementation. Do we have a microphone for him?
Thank you very much for that introduction, Sasha. My question is to Chris. The Communication Act says no spectrum windfalls. And the question is this a possible concern with the chairman's plan on the broadcast ban? In the late 1980s and early 1980s, when the FCC chair, then FCC chair, was considering giving the broadcaster spectrum flexibility for HD TV, one of the major concerns at the FCC was that this would be in violation of the Spectrum Windfall Clause, which is one reason it went to Congress and it was included in the Telecom Act of 1996. Since then, the FCC has been quite free in giving incumbents spectrum windfalls. In the TV broadcast ban, for example, in the last 5 years, they were granted the right to shift from site-based to geographic service area licensing, a huge windfall worth billions of dollars, and the recent allowance for them to switch from HD TV and standard definition TV, which were fixed services, and high definition to mobile TV, another windfall worth billions of dollars. And the question is, we seem to be at this stage where these windfalls are okay and nobody thinks they're in violation of the Communications Act. Everybody agrees politically the only way we're going to open up the broadcast ban for the services that we need as a society is to give it to the broadcasters somehow for free, because politically they're too powerful ever to prevent them not getting a windfall. So the question is, forget about the politics, which are clear. Julius has nailed that down. That's the only way we're going to get access to it. What about the law? Maybe somebody will sue and say, the government can't give billions of dollars of public assets to a powerful industry for nothing.
Sure.
So I'm going to repeat the question due to the gesticulation.
Good. It gives me more time to think of my answer.
But and correct me if I get this wrong, but the question is, what about the legalities of giving away funding from auctions to license holders?
So I would throw on top of that list mobile satellite service providers getting ATC authority, and the list probably could go on and on. I've been around for a portion of it, but not all of it. First of all, take a half step back to answer the question. The chairman mentioned Los Angeles and how few of the channels are actually being used. Here in the DC market, 13 of the 49 channels are being used. That's 78 megahertz of spectrum that's being used out of 294 that's been allocated. So there's obviously clearly a problem there. With CEA, CTIA put a proposal into the record that was designed to continue to support free over-the-air broadband television, but to give an opportunity for broadcasters to upgrade their technology so that they could have more of almost like a cellularized architecture. And the end result would be you could repack the broadcasters and recover 100 to 180 megahertz of spectrum. When we put that together trying to think through what some of the legal barriers were to reallocating the broadcaster spectrum, but also obviously we had the political issues in mind also. I think you raise a good question, and I know that the chairman is trying to do all that he can to facilitate a free market movement of spectrum from current uses to more efficient uses. And I think we're going to see that. He hinted at it in the mobile satellite space and in some of the other allocations. So, we want to wait to see how it plays out. I think you raise a good question. There are other questions. I think for the first time, at least since I've been in this business, we're shining a very bright light on the allocation to broadcasters, not on the broadcasters, not on individual stations' usage, because I do think there is a benefit to that. There's a public interest benefit to that. We recognize it. But to the overall allocation and to the fact that there is close to 300 megahertz of spectrum that is, it's just woefully underused in every market. I mean, you could pick New York City, D.C., and Los Angeles and see a staggering amount of spectrum that isn't being used. And in part it's because the allocation was set up and the technology was set up at a point when there wasn't a spectrum, really, such demand for spectrum uses. So I'm dancing around the answer to your question because that's what my law degree taught me to do. But there are a number of difficult issues. That is one of them, and we'll see. It came up a long time ago, and I think we had a section of the Act that came out as a result of that. We, CTIA and CEA, have highlighted that section of the Act where it says that the Commission is required to do a look at the broadcaster spectrum and usage with the goal of possibly reallocating some of it. We've highlighted that for the Commission. I think that section of the Act came out during one of the debates about providing a windfall for broadcasters. But again, I think the chairman is trying to do his best to try to find a market-based mechanism for reallocating some of the spectrum so that we can bring it to market and that it doesn't take the 15 years that AWS and 700 took from beginning to end. If we wait 15 years to get that spectrum, we won't be the leading economy when it comes to the mobile ecosystem.
Matt, you had something to add, and then we'll go to Julie.
Sure. And I think you're also referring to not just the windfall statutes, but 309J, which says auction proceeds have to go to the Treasury and not necessarily out to people who might feel like they deserve a part of it. Maybe there's a statutory fix. Maybe there are ways to coordinate so that it's not auction funds going directly from the government to the broadcasters. But as Chairman Genachowski said, there's a lot of work to be done, both on the legality of this and just how it would work in practical terms. I guess I would just put another plug in, though, too, for unlicensed use and TV white spaces. And I don't think TV white spaces either ends the debate, probably starts the debate more than ends it when it comes to the reallocation question. But not to sully the commissioner's, the chairman's Olympics references with the reference to steroids, but Wi-Fi on steroids has been proposed as a way to use those TV bands also, and to get the people using those now, not 5 or 10 or 15 years from now. But the reallocation question is obviously a difficult political one, difficult legal one as well, and you highlight a lot of those questions that have to be answered.
And just to reiterate, it's not just the Communication Act bans against windfalls. There are a lot of other statutory regulations to prevent giving away public assets to private interest without an auction or without fair due process. And I think those are legitimate concerns.
Thanks, Jim. Julie, you're good. Great. Ben, I know Derek Slater in your shop at Free Press did a pretty significant survey of television white space all across the country, and I'm forgetting the name of the report, so I'm hoping you remember. And also I was hoping maybe you could lay out a couple, because I know that there's a lot of questions right now as to what to do with the television white space, and I think whereas there's general agreement across the board that we want a rich ecosystem of different spectrum allocation and assignments, from everything from unlicensed, opportunistic spectrum access and auctions. I know that television white space in particular is an area where the public interest groups have been really pushing for the unlicensed and opportunistic spectrum access side of things. But the name of that report?
It had a long and Washington-sounding name. The basic point was exactly the one that Chris is making, which is there's just a ton of available spectrum under 1 gig that can be utilized for wireless broadband. And, the debate, obviously there was a sort of windfall moment, or windfall is maybe a Freudian slip. There was a watershed moment when the commission announced that they were looking at broadcast spectrum, and there was all kinds of flurry of activity around that because, of course, we just gone through the digital television transition, and that seemed to be sort of counterintuitive that we'd be looking to take spectrum back, that we had just organized this expensive system to preserve the service. And also, of course, underneath that was the white spaces debate. If you clear the broadcasters off, then the idea of picking off the channels in between the broadcasters for the use of unlicensed white spaces, that doesn't make sense anymore because you're going to be auctioning that. To me, the principle of the white space debate is what we always fought for, which is in any place where there is underutilized spectrum, we need to be finding ways to take advantage of it. We need to be, I recall my early days in Washington, sitting in meetings not unlike this one, where such interesting topics as the interference temperature and the possibilities for overlays and underlays were brought up. I continue to believe that those debates need to be revisited and put back on the table. I also think we need to look not just at spectrum that we could take from somebody and give to somebody else, or spectrum that's currently lying fallow that we could auction off that isn't encumbered. We should be looking at spectrum that is allocated not just to the broadcasters but isn't being fully utilized, that where you've got a license area that's not been fully built out. I think this is a big issue in a lot of rural states. And I'm not necessarily casting aspersions on the carriers who are licensed to use that spectrum. In some cases, there's no business case to do it, but that doesn't mean there aren't people there who need to be getting access. How can we make use of that spectrum? In tribal lands, I know, Sasha, you guys have done a lot of work looking at a Native American angle on spectrum that's above tribal lands. I think there are all kinds of ways we can get a more effective, more efficient use of spectrum. That was always the principle of the white space debate. The brilliance of the white space device is that it doesn't really care what band it transmits on. If we use up all of the broadcast bands because we've taken them back and reallocated them for licensed use, it can find spectrum anywhere else that is so indicated for available use. We can also look at, I think, dedicated unlicensed bands in this spectrum is a critical component of how we reallocate. That to generate the kind of innovation that came out of the so-called junk bands, we ought to be actively trying to do what we did by accident 10 years ago.
Very good. Other questions? Go over here and then back over to there.
Hi.
Can you wait for the microphone? Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question about minority access adoption. A lot of the discussion has been around the technology of broadband, but there's a lot of kind of startling studies that have come out very recently within the past couple of weeks showing a huge disparity between broadband adoption between minority communities, specifically Hispanic and African American, and white communities, or non-Hispanic or African American communities. It seems as though a lot of the purpose of the plan is to bring broadband or bring wireless, right? But is that enough? If you build it, will they actually come? Analysis doesn't seem to have held true. what recommendations would you give to policymakers in trying to analyze getting people actually to use broadband, to use wireless, to use devices, create applications, and send people to start technology startups and become builders of an internet revolution, for lack of a better term?
That's a great question. Where are you from? Which group?
Just on the Hill.
On the
Prefer not to
Hill.
go
Ah,
Hobbits.
smart question from the Hill. Who wants to address it first?
Hey, you want to take it?
I'll be we go to the end and everybody else step backwards. No, I mean that's a vital issue, a very important issue, and one that we've worked on and everybody is concerned with. I think there are two issues at least within that: the mobile divide that the chairman referenced today, and then more largely speaking, the digital divide. And as people's access gets better at the top end, as wireline deployment gets better, as speeds get faster on both wired and wireless platforms, maybe the people in those communities of color, as we often say, might catch up to yesterday's technology, but maybe not to the current state of the art. We've said that mobile is the numbers are a little bit better there. I think, especially even in the FCC survey that was announced yesterday, when the chairman was at the Brookings Institution, to mention another think tank, and doing his tour this week of previewing parts of the plan. Those gaps are narrowing somewhat, especially when you look at mobile usage. Those communities are maybe over-indexing on usage and catching up. But again, because wireless is tremendous and has tremendous mobility benefits and giving people access anytime, anywhere, those are all good benefits. The fact that it's, at present at least, and for the foreseeable future, the next few years at the very minimum, not going to be giving the same kinds of speeds and the same kind of capabilities to people. It's hard to apply for a job on your iPhone, to word process, or to fill out even a web form that might be required for a job application. So there are definitely issues to be addressed there. The mobile divide is a problem, getting people access, and not only increasing deployment, but also increasing affordability and people's ability to adopt those technologies. Once we build them, they won't come if they can't afford them. So not to parse too closely what the chairman said about the mobility fund, because we're, of course, anxious to see the details, but he mentioned increasing adoption, but then he's kind of transitioned into deployment, and of course, there are programs within USF for spurring adoption, for subsidizing the costs for individuals, and not just for the people deploying the facilities. I don't know if that's a good answer. I mean, there's just a basket of issues there that you're very correct and wise to point out, but that there's really no simple answer to. I think there are a lot of different variables in play here.
What I would add, and I agree with everything that was said, is that if you look at some of the reports, the Pew has done a number of ongoing surveys, and some really interesting statistics have come out of that. For example, one of the things that struck me and I found most interesting was when they asked their respondents whether they had ever purchased or used an e-reader. The number of whites or Caucasians that 0% said they had of those surveyed. The number of Hispanics was 1%, and the number of African Americans, I believe, was 8%. And so the sort of some of the conclusion that came from it was not just a technical divide that was closed or being closed by usage in the African American community, but it was also a literacy divide. And we do see mobility and mobile broadband as something that will begin to really close the digital divide, because the numbers in terms of adoption in the minority communities are either on par or above the adoption levels in the Caucasian or white community. And in fact, when we see a divide, as the chairman mentioned, sort of a mobile divide, it seems to be more geographic based rather than socioeconomic based. It seems to be based on areas that, I mean, let's be honest, West Virginia is not the easiest terrain to build out any type of technology solution, and neither is Alaska. So it's good that there is a mobile mobility fund in play to help get service to those areas. But I do believe that mobile broadband will help to close both the literacy divide and the digital divide, because it is something where we're seeing real significant adoption in the minority communities.
Add just a couple of things to that, which is, I started out by saying that we've all heard lots of speeches about broadband that say broadband is good for you. And typically the policy focuses on supply side for availability, but availability doesn't really get you anything. Adoption gets you the benefits. So our goal shouldn't be 100% availability. Our goal should be 100% adoption. And that's always been the way goals were set for infrastructure services in the past, whether it was electrification or telephone service. And I think there are three factors. One is we've got to get people the computers and the know-how to get online. And that's always been a block of folks who simply didn't have the equipment or the training in order to make use of a broadband connection. Second is we got to look at issues of price. You can get at that either through universal service programs like Lifeline and LinkUp, or you can get at that by promoting competition to see if market forces will drive down costs. And third is you've got to increase the value of the service. I think one of the interesting things is that we see over-indexing on mobile services and over-indexing on cable television, both of which cost much more than a wireline broadband connection. It's because consumers see more value in those services. And what makes a wireline broadband service, a baseline broadband service valuable is speed, because speed translates into cool stuff that you can do. And I think this is where the chairman is right on to promote 100 megabit goals, because that is going to facilitate the kinds of applications, high quality video, gaming, entertainment, online health, education, you name it, that are going to make people say, wow, I want to buy that service because of all the cool stuff it does. So there are both adoption sort of demand side programs and supply side programs that I think we ought to be looking at.
Thank you. We'll go over here and then right up front.
My name is Bonnie Bracy Sutton. I'm with Imaginos. Also work with the George Lucas Education Foundation. I haven't heard a lot about education. I've been working with CTIA, but out in the field, there are schools that don't even have broadband. And workforce readiness is a concern that 18 groups have come to Washington. Is there anything going to be in any of the opportunity funds that will provide techno-fluency for teachers in the classroom? Everybody talks about, let's teach the kids all the cool stuff the kids can do. What about equipping the people who are in the classrooms to know what you're talking about for community, all the things that can happen there, to understand how the content divide can be changed, the information divide can be changed, and being able to understand what the world is like now when you really do have broadband. A lot of teachers don't have a clue. And I'm not saying that as a criticism. They don't have broadband. They don't know.
So you volunteer again?
Sure.
Too willing to talk, I guess. Another excellent question. I think traditionally that's a little bit outside of the FCC's ambit, for better or worse. And it's kind of going back to Ben's framing. What this plan is doing is filling in that question mark. How do we get from these to these national goals that everybody agrees are vital for us to achieve, like improving education, getting tools to people and teaching them how to use them, so it's not just, here's a computer, good luck, but actually giving them a chance to succeed with it. I think the good thing about the National Broadband Plan is the, in terms of getting to point 3 then, getting past the question mark, what can the FCC do to facilitate deployment and adoption? In looking at those national goals, they were charged by Congress with looking at national goals, including education, healthcare, energy efficiency, and these other vital goals that broadband will help us to achieve. And the fact that they're coordinating, at least to some degree, with the Department of Education seems like the best place for a program like that to reside. But that's not to say the FCC can or should divorce itself from those questions and pay no attention to them. It's just that they probably need to partner with people who are working with the schools more directly than just through the E-rate program as part of USF that gives money to schools for connectivity.
This gentleman over here has been waiting patiently. Thank you.
Yes, one of the chairmen, I'm Bruce Hahn with the American Homeowners Grassroots Alliance. One of the comments by the chairman was the plan to interest the broadcasters to participate in spectrum auctions. They have not in the past been enthusiastic about that idea. And after he finished, I went out while he was waiting for the elevator and asked, well, how are you planning to encourage them to do that? And his cryptic two-word response was, stay tuned. So now I'm intrigued, and I'm wondering for all of you, what do you think the FCC might be planning in that regard, or what would you suggest that they plan to or offer to get the broadcasters willing to participate in the spectrum auctions?
So we've entered into conjecture, but if somebody, maybe I might reframe it a little bit. What would you like to see the FCC do? I won't say to broadcasters. That sounds a little awful, but with broadcasters on some of these issues.
Let me save you guys. I'm saving you only momentarily. You got to answer that.
I think my phone's ringing in the other.
Yeah. Last I checked, it was your proposal to auction off all their spectrum. So I'll first stipulate that over-the-air broadcasting continues to be an important service in a lot of communities.
Agreed.
And the
Agreed.
services that they provide are essential, and we shouldn't talk about the future as if the role of local information is irrelevant. In an internet era, it's not. Broadcasting continues to play an important role. That said, there are a lot of people who believe that broadcasting industry as it exists today doesn't have a business in 10 years. And therefore, it makes sense to entertain these kinds of proposals about how to use spectrum better that's currently being occupied by broadcast channels. Pack them down, put them in the satellite band, figure out ways to make them more effective, incent them to participate in an auction. I have to say for myself, the notion that we would buy back spectrum from licensees who got the spectrum for free in the first place sits very poorly with me. I don't like that idea. I understand the politics around it, and I understand the position of the broadcasters are in right now, but I think that question's got to be really carefully considered, and I think it's going to have to take an act of Congress to allow that to happen, because otherwise it's in violation of the Communications Act. But all of these hurdles being what they are, we've got to entertain notions of how to facilitate a plan whereby the broadcasters and the services they provide continue to meet the needs of the communities that use them today, while thinking simultaneously about a glide path towards the future where we use that spectrum more effectively. And the broadcasters may well play a role in that. Maybe the broadcasters become a competitor or a member of Chris's association. You never know. And
We'd welcome that.
So with that, I'll hand the baton to you, Chris, and you can.
I mean, I agree with what Ben said. I'll pause for a second. I haven't said that too many times. Let me say that again. I will agree with what Ben said.
This is being recorded, right?
You know, I agree that broadcasters perform a very important local role. I agree that the question of how to reallocate their spectrum is a very difficult legal and political one. I do go back to the fact that just looking at DC, 78 out of the 294 megahertz is being used, so something has to change. And whether it's an incentive to, maybe it's not buying them out, but paying them for their investment in their stranded equipment. Maybe it's paying for their investment in stranded equipment and giving them some form of carriage rights that will make them recognize that they still have the ability to provide service. Maybe it's not over the air, but maybe it's still directly to the eyeballs that they want to get to. It is a difficult question. I believe that we have this sort of laser focus on the broadcasters, and yet the chairman mentioned 500 megahertz. So even if you were able to reallocate all 300 that was allocated to the broadcasters, you wouldn't get to 500. It's math that I've learned from my 9-year-old daughter. And so, you know, there are a number of other areas and bands that we are looking at beyond just the broadcasters, and the same issue is going to arise about how do you either reallocate them or provide an incentive for them to want to be reallocated. And so the issue about a windfall to broadcasters comes up with satellite providers who received their spectrum free. And there are a number of satellite providers who are operating a very viable service, and they can and should be allowed to continue, and there shouldn't be. I'm looking at my previous boss here, Miss Cornell. But there are a number of providers, satellite providers, who are providing a very viable and very legitimate business. There are also a number that have been in and out of bankruptcy a number of times, who have failed to launch satellites, whose satellites are crashing to Earth, who have a one-way service when they're supposed to have a two-way service, who have asked for multiple extensions of requirements that they've been given by the FCC. Some of them the simplest of requirements, like entering into a contract to build a satellite or launching a satellite. So, and then you're also going to have to provide some incentive when you look at the government spectrum. And I think these issues are going to come up. Congress did pass a law to be able to redirect funds, Commercial Spectrum Enhancement Act, to redirect auction funds to government users to be able to update and upgrade their equipment so that you could repack them or move them. So I think everything has to be on the table. That's been our statement all along. Everything has to be on the table. And when you look at the countries that we compete against, Germany or the UK, you know, they each have 350 megahertz in the pipeline right now. And they have 300 to 350 in use right now. So they're going to be up to 700 in the next couple of years. They have 1/3 to 1/5 the number of subscribers that we do, and they're spreading that that spectrum across maybe 3 or 4 providers instead of 5 to 7 that we have in the major markets here. So clearly the equation is not going to work, and when you throw on top what we see as sort of a biblical increase in spectrum usage, everything has to be on the table.
Can I just make one math correction? We have 296 retail spectrum, and so many reports just focus on that. That's the 300 you referred to. But they also have 85 megahertz of electronic news gathering spectrum at 2.1 gigahertz. Incredibly valuable, so that gets us close to 400. Broadcasters, in addition, have several gigahertz, a pretty good spectrum for auxiliary and also other electronic news gathering services, including 500 megahertz right near the DBS bands, which can be used for DBS. So the math is not quite they have more spectrum than it appears at first glance, and it's one of the major critiques of much of the literature. They just focus on the 296. They don't focus on these others, even more grossly underutilized. But if you're going to go after anything, go after the electronic news gathering bands, which, I mean, why does one industry get free backhaul and another have to pay for it? You could view it as an outrage. So I'd encourage those bands to be part of the spectrum arithmetic that we use more frequently.
Just when we thought we were turning the corner here, Jim brings us back to earth. What other countries are doing vis-a-vis the United States.
Well, just echo Chris's point, though, too. I mean, we shouldn't focus only on the broadcasters. You know, if you think they're tough, they don't have tanks and airplanes and stuff. The Department of Defense and other people like that are in this conversation, too. But, again, piling questions on top of questions when it comes to how do we do this. When the chairman talked about a strictly voluntary program, that leads me to wonder, and we'll see in a month, I guess, exactly how that would work to develop a nationwide business model. Or, we would have some markets with very robust new amounts of spectrum coming into the pipeline and others where there wouldn't be any. So I think there are obviously a lot of questions to be answered, and I'm sure they're working very hard on answering those, but we're all kind of waiting to see what that stay tuned means.
So I'm going to wrap this up now, and I'll leave it with the panel. We've heard this 30,000-foot view from the FCC as to sort of the general silos that they're looking at. What would you want to be, what's your number one detail that you would love to see in the actual plan when it's released on March 17th?
Yeah, start with that.
No, I've taken too many for the team, haven't I?
All right.
Number one detail in terms of what we heard about today. To be easy, I'll finish where I was just a minute ago and say that exactly if we are going to have this kind of debate about reallocation, it'd be interesting to see exactly how this voluntary reallocation program would work, exactly how detailed they can be, in what is in essence a plan to make other plans, and then how that does fit in with the TV white spaces and making sure that we maintain some sort of contiguous spectrum bands below a certain amount, but below 3 gigahertz or wherever, as low as we can get it, for unlicensed use, for shared use. Just seeing some more details on exactly how this equation works together as we think about all the different ways to make more efficient use of these bands that we're talking about here.
Thanks, man.
Well, I'll cite a category so that I can get more real estate. Say that I'd like to see a strong competition policy in this plan, especially on wireless. I want to know not just where are we going to get the 500 megahertz, but who's it going to go to, and how is that likely to happen, and is that going to promote competition or is it going to reduce competition? I'd like to see competition policy on transport with the special access issue. I'd like to see wireless data roaming, which I think is another very important pro-competition policy in the wireless market. And I'd like to see strong consumer protections and transparency rules, which I think facilitate consumers moving between providers and knowing exactly what they're getting so that they can hold providers accountable and get a good price for the service they're paying for. I think all of those things are an important part of building competition policy in the wireless market.
Thank you. One detail in subparts A through H. Julie, yes.
And I'm just going to take a very high-level approach, which is I think we want to see something that is flexible and something that can help foresee into the future, that doesn't lock us into a model that works today, but does help us get to the next U2 and the next iPad.
More devices from
devices,
CEA.
More stuff.
Yeah.
Or the first iPad.
Right.
I think
Chris.
the chairman has set the foundation, and so I want to see some details to how we build on it, how we bring the 500 megahertz to market over an extended period of time. I agree there should be a mix of licensed and unlicensed. I think both are necessary. So just some more detail on what is the plan beyond just the broadcasters for bringing the spectrum to market, and are there backup plans if the voluntary doesn't come to fruition, or if enough entities don't take advantage of it, are there next steps in place?
Very good. Well, thank you, Chris, Julie, Ben, and Matt for coming out here today, and thank you to you all for participating in this panel. Please welcome, thank this panel.